The banquet hall of High Regent Calvorin glittered with polished crystal, floating chandeliers, and the cold elegance of alien aristocracy who believed themselves untouchable in both power and intellect. And at the center of it all sat the human envoy, unarmed, unarmored, dressed in simple formal wear that looked almost insulting compared to the jeweled war regalia surrounding him. Yet he showed no fear, only quiet patience as he accepted the endless stream of veiled insults disguised as diplomacy, while the nobles whispered among themselves that humanity had finally sent a submissive representative, a gesture of surrender wrapped in etiquette, unaware that the human named Elias Korr had not come to plead but to observe, and more importantly, to be underestimated. The first mistake came when Lord Varel openly mocked humanity's fragile biology, earning amused laughter from the court as holographic displays projected human military data distorted to appear insignificant, and Elias simply raised his glass in polite acknowledgement, which the nobles took as weakness rather than restraint. The second mistake came when they sealed the hall under the pretense of security protocol, disabling all external communications and assuming the human could be isolated like a frightened animal, not realizing isolation was only dangerous if your enemies were your only lifeline. The third mistake unfolded when they revealed their hidden enforcement cadre, elite genetic warriors stepping from the shadows to ensure compliance, believing the unarmed human would finally break. Yet Elias only sighed softly, as if disappointed they had misunderstood the entire point of diplomacy. Because what none of them knew was that the banquet hall itself had been chosen by humanity, not the nobles in every crystal pillar. Every ventilation current, every shimmering chandelier had been seeded with microscopic adaptive systems waiting for the correct authorization phrase embedded casually in Elias's opening toast, a phrase the nobles had dismissed as ceremonial fluff. When Lord Varel ordered his warriors forward, the lights dimmed, not due to sabotage, but awakening, and the room responded like a living organism, sealing exits, mapping threats, and broadcasting a silent pulse across the planetary network that identified every noble present as secondary hostiles in a containment scenario. Elias finally stood, placing his glass down with deliberate calm, and for the first time the nobles felt something they had never associated with humanity before: uncertainty, because the human who was supposed to be defenseless was not looking at them like prey or even enemies, but like a system correcting an error. Outside the palace, orbital ships that had been drifting invisibly in synchronized formation activated their descent protocols, not launching an attack but enforcing quarantine. While inside, the nobles realized too late that their banquet had never been a negotiation or a trap for the human, but a controlled exposure event designed to map every hidden threat in their society. Elias spoke at last, his voice quiet but carrying unnaturally through the sealed hall, explaining that humanity did not send soldiers to diplomacy because diplomacy was already a battlefield, and they had simply chosen the terrain. When the enforcement cadre attempted to strike, their bodies froze mid-motion, neural overrides triggered by systems they did not know they were already connected to, and one by one their weapons powered down as if the concept of violence itself had been revoked. Panic spread like wildfire among the nobles as they realized the truth. The defenseless human was not defenseless at all, but unnecessary, because the real strength of humanity was not in individuals but in inevitability, in systems that turned arrogance into containment and aggression into data. And as Elias turned to leave, the chandeliers reignited, the doors unlocked, and the banquet returned to its pristine silence. Except now every noble understood the same chilling lesson at once. The human had not been trapped at their table. They had been seated at humanity's. And yet the true terror did not come from the silence that followed, but from what remained unseen. Because over the next few seconds the nobles began to notice subtle fractures in their reality. Private security codes no longer responded to their biometrics. Ancestral vaults beneath the palace quietly reassigned ownership in the planetary ledger, and distant military fleets that had sworn fealty to the noble houses suddenly began broadcasting standardized human peacekeeping protocols instead of obedience signals. Elias had not conquered the room. He had merely opened a door that had already been unlocked long before he arrived. And now the entire aristocratic system was revealing how thoroughly it had been studied, modeled, and patiently prepared for correction. Lord Varel, trembling with rage and disbelief, demanded to know what kind of sorcery this was, only for Elias to respond with a faint, almost tired expression that it was not sorcery, but patience, centuries of it, Because humanity had learned early that civilizations like theirs always assumed superiority was permanent, and permanence was always exploitable. Outside the palace, orbital shadows resolved into a vast humanitarian fleet whose existence had been classified not for secrecy, but for psychological stability of emerging civilizations, and each ship now synchronized with the banquet hall systems, confirming compliance levels across the entire planet in real time. The nobles tried to flee but found that escape routes were not blocked. They simply no longer existed as valid options in any navigational system, as if the world itself had quietly decided certain futures were no longer permitted. Elias finally walked among them unhurried, not threatening, not even judging, which somehow made it worse, because judgment implied uncertainty, and he had none, only completion. He explained as he passed that humanity did not arrive to win wars anymore, because winning implied resistance, and resistance implied parity, and parity implied risk. So instead they arrived to end conditions before they escalated into wars at all. By the time he reached the grand doors of the banquet hall, the nobles had already stopped seeing him as an individual, because it was impossible to hate a man who was clearly only the interface of something much larger, something that had already accounted for every possible rebellion they might attempt. And when the doors finally opened and he stepped into the night air of the palace terrace, the entire noble court realized with horrifying clarity that the banquet had never been about diplomacy, intimidation, or surrender. It had been a diagnostic, and they had just been marked as either compliant, obsolete, or scheduled for gentle replacement. The night air outside the palace should have felt like freedom, yet for the nobles who followed at a distance, it felt like stepping out of one room only to discover the universe itself had been rearranged while they were not looking, because above them the sky was no longer merely sky but a structured lattice of silent human presence, orbital platforms drifting like patient thoughts, far too precise to be natural, far too still to be anything but controlled. Elias stood at the edge of the terrace watching the city lights below with an expression that was almost contemplative, as if he were observing an old memory rather than a conquered world, and that unsettled the nobles more than any threat could have, because conquest usually came with emotion, anger, pride, hunger, but he carried none of it. Behind him, Lord Varel finally broke, shouting that humanity had no right to rewrite sovereign systems, that the noble houses had ruled this sector for millennia, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own uncertainty, as even his translators began subtly altering the meaning of his words into calmer, more compliant phrasing, as though language itself was refusing to escalate conflict. Elias did not turn immediately, and when he did, it was with the patience of someone explaining a truth that had been discovered long ago, and simply waited for others to notice it, saying softly that sovereignty required continuity, and continuity required responsibility, and responsibility required competence, which the nobles had just demonstrated they could no longer guarantee. At that moment, the first planetary compliance signal was confirmed, not by human announcement, but by automatic surrender of 3 military command grids that had quietly voted to disarm themselves after detecting irreversible instability in their leadership hierarchy. Panic surged again among the nobles, but even panic felt muted, as if the world was gently lowering the volume of their resistance. Elias raised a hand, and for the first time, visible structures in the sky shifted. Not weapons, not threats, but administrative systems descending like luminous bridges between orbit and ground. He explained that humanity had learned from its earliest contact failures that fear created resistance, resistance created casualties, and casualties created cycles. So instead, they replaced cycles with thresholds. Once a civilization crossed certain behavioral markers, intervention became not a choice but a protocol. The nobles finally understood the unbearable truth. They were not being punished, nor invaded, nor even judged in the traditional sense. They were being processed. And as Elias stepped forward into the descending light, vanishing upward into the waiting system above, the last thing he left behind was not a warning or a threat, but a quiet statement that echoed across every failed noble communication channel at once. You were never defenseless against us. You were only ever unmeasured, and in the hours that followed, the word unmeasured spread through the noble worlds like a sickness that could not be treated because it did not describe violence, but irrelevance, and that was far more devastating. Archives were reopened. Encrypted histories suddenly became readable without keys, and entire generations of political records were quietly reclassified under a single human designation. Pre-contact instability phase. A phrase that sounded clinical until one realized it meant every war they had ever fought. Every conquest they had ever celebrated had already been categorized as predictable noise long before Elias ever entered the banquet hall. On the palace world itself, life did not end. It adjusted. Because nothing had been destroyed in the conventional sense, yet everything had been subtly reorganized, from trade routes that now bypassed noble taxation grids to military academies that found their curriculum replaced overnight with human standard conflict de-escalation models, as if history itself had been quietly corrected while no one was looking. Lord Varel, once a symbol of aristocratic pride, now stood in a sealed observation chamber watching his own authority dissolve into procedural updates, his voice reduced to a flagged advisory note in a system that no longer required his approval. And far above, in orbit, Elias finally reappeared among human command structures, not as a victor returning from battle, but as a field analyst reporting completion of a diplomatic exposure cycle, his calm voice stating that local governance had been successfully transitioned from ego-based hierarchy to stability-based compliance, with minimal structural disruption. Yet even then, something lingered in the human fleet. Not triumph, but confirmation, because this outcome was not surprising, only expected, and expectation was the most dangerous form of power humanity had ever developed. Below, the noble worlds continued to debate what had happened at the banquet, some insisting it was coercion, others calling it enlightenment. But the truth, none of them could escape, was simpler and colder than both interpretations. They had assumed the human was defenseless because he arrived alone, when in reality, he was merely the visible edge of an entire civilization that no longer needed to announce its strength to enforce it. And as the stars above resumed their silent alignment, the final archived entry from the banquet world was recorded in human logs with sterile precision. Subject, civilization. Responsive. Status, stabilized. Risk category, permanently downgraded.